Welcome to the Salt of the Earth podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Cobb, joined by my co-host,
Thomas Pope.
and today we're here with episode 5 of the Salt of the Earth. So today we're going to talk about, first off, Thomas's video from this Monday. Also, our main topic for this week are traditions.
Our main topic are traditions. Is traditions?
Our main topic is traditions.
And then we will have an English lesson. Yeah.
Then we'll have a pronunciation lesson.
Lesson. Yes. We will learn us a lesson.
So, I guess you can... I already edited the video, or partly, so I'm a little bit better acquainted with it than I would have been otherwise, but you can go ahead and give us your summary of it, if you like.
So basically, it was about just me kind of thinking about how sometimes we put a very large focus on things like attending church, sometimes maybe too much of a focus, and how sometimes that's kind of seen as like the way you can be a good Christian is if you attend all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the video was just kind of maybe challenging that idea and saying that maybe, that's not the most important thing. It is an important thing, but maybe there are things that at times would be more beneficial, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, when I was watching your video, what I kind of got out of it, I'm not sure if this is what you're intending or not, but I kind of what I saw you saying is that we tend to want to have rules that we can, or structures that we can follow, but we may not be but that we may use that as an excuse to not be fully devoted in spirit, or because we are following doing this and this and this, we may not actually be devoted in spirit. It's kind of what it seemed like you're getting at.
It's not exactly what I was getting at, but it's all kind of lumped in there is the idea of sometimes we can see doing a physical thing like attending church every possible time as our kind of our duty as a Christian, as the thing that we do to I don't know, get closer to God and then we kind of ignore what's the spiritual benefit? Am I actually going to church to learn? And am I going to encourage people? Am I going to benefit from it? And am I going to bring benefit to other people? We don't think about that as much as we think about just going to church, because that's just what you do. So yeah, definitely kind of there definitely was the idea of kind of doing something and then ignoring
the reason for it.
The reason.
Yeah. Well, to me, it seems like as humans, we like to have boxes we can check. We like to be able to say we do this and this and this. That way, we can tangibly see what it is that we're doing that is getting us closer to heaven. But we do not. But that sometimes we don't like to think about as much of the relationship aspect of it.
Right. Definitely. We like to check boxes, and that's something that I've seen in myself a lot in the past. I wasn't necessarily trying to get at it in the video, but if it's there, it's there. It's there because it makes sense. Because things like going to church is like, check that box. I'm a good Christian.
Yeah.
And something I brought up in the video was that, that's kind of, I've fallen into that trap as well. I think we all have at some point where, viewing religion as a checked box or as a series of checked boxes, it's a pitfall, because once we think we have all the boxes checked, we kind of don't do anything more, right?
Yeah. It's how religion is actually based, so some people still want to hold on to that method, because obviously Judaism was that to the extreme.
Yeah, you keep every aspect of the law in order to be saved.
Like, there was so many laws and rules and stuff, and that and people, though it was difficult, people could tangibly see what they had to do, and you could easily see from a worldly perspective, like who was doing the right things and who wasn't, because it was all, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this, which is why the Old Testament is such a huge book, because a lot of
there were so many things to do, and so while it was it was easy for you to see tangibly whether you or another person was doing them, there's also just so many things, so it'd be so easy to forget one or to, not put in the effort required to get all of them.
Mm-hmm. And then with the death, burial, and resurrection, we have a new covenant, and now everything's, from my understanding, we're no longer based on a rule system. We're based on a
so we're no longer based on a system of law. We're based on a system of like a spirit.
Yeah, we're based on a relationship system. So what matters is our relationship with Christ, and also it's a system of under grace. Yeah.
Right. So it's no longer do these things to be saved. It's you are saved if you accept my offer. And then you'll naturally hear some things you should want to do after that point. It's kind of it's just very different. And so really as Christians, that whole view of like checked boxes, we shouldn't be thinking that way, because that's old news. That's gone away.
Yeah. That's the Old Testament.
Our perspective should be spiritual, not fleshly. We should be thinking of things in a different way. And something I mentioned in the video was like, I know just in my life, there have been like time after time when I've kind of woken up a little bit and recognized like, I was viewing things as a checked box. And along with that realization was that even if it was checked boxes, I don't have them all checked, but it's not really like that. So just time after time, I kind of like, I'm not actually like, I have this tendency to, I think we have this tendency to kind of see ourselves as like secure, like, all right, I'm saved, I'm good. If I were to die right now, I'm good. But then sometimes that leads to us being complacent.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
yeah,
just kind of got to realize sometimes again and again that we're not 100% secure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the whole check boxes thing is, I think it is an issue that a lot of people struggle with, because you definitely can tell that a lot of people that come to church, well, across America, there's a lot of people that come to church, and that is their extent of their faith.
Mm-hmm.
And what you mentioned in the video, and yeah, so I guess it is a good thing that we need to realize, is that our faith is not, our church attendance is not what we do for our faith. It is what we do.
It's just part of it.
It's kind of part of it, but it's also kind of what we have to encourage us in our walk.
Mm-hmm.
It should be our resting place, our refueling station. It should not be our task.
That should not be our all.
Like we if we think about it as a task we do, that's all wrong. We should think about it as, this is what we want to do to help us in our walk.
Mm-hmm. And
it's just a perspective shift.
And if you really think about it, the examples that we're following are Jesus and his disciples and the apostles. After Jesus died and was resurrected. And if you look at their lives were not a once a week thing at all. They were traveling around 24/7. They were going to different towns. They were preaching to different towns and villages. They were doing things more or less constantly. And then the apostles, after, Jesus had ascended, they were they were giving much more than a couple hours once a week of their life.
Yeah.
And so I think if we're using those as our example, if that's the kind of the standard of what Christian life should be, then we compare that to ourselves, and
we all fall short.
We ain't it. And so that's kind of part of the thought, is that just recognizing that if all we're doing is, and maybe it's not even once a week, maybe we're like I mentioned, I grew up in a family where we attended every possible one you could, so like Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, whatever there was. If there was any sort of extra activities or meetings or things, we were there. You could even be that type of person, and maybe you're meeting 3 or 4 times a week, but maybe that's still not the level of time and devotion you should be putting into it,
Mm-hmm.
So it's not there's no matter of like, oh well, I'm doing as much as my church offers, I'm attending all the programs that my church offers, because that's the point. Isn't what your church offers, the point is what should you be doing individually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it comes back to a perspective issue that seems like a lot of people have, which I haven't really thought about this too much, but it seems to me that we often think about church, as the thing we do in our faith, but we should think about it as like a training, or like school or something. Like for instance, college is not your end all be all. You don't go to college to make money. You don't go to college to achieve success. You go to college to prepare yourself and learn. And I think that's how we should view church sometimes, is we don't go to church because that's what will bring us success in our faith. We go to church to prepare us for our daily struggles, or our outreach, or our walk with God in general.
And to fellowship with other Christians and be encouraged and encourage them, kind of a mutual thing.
Mutual aid. And so if we think about it that way, then attendance I don't think we should have, it should help us to not to think of attendance as our the way that we sometimes struggle with it.
When we look at it that way, it should be something that we want to do as much as possible.
Exactly.
Not something that we're doing as much as possible because it's good in and of itself, or because, we'll be a good Christian if we do it, but because we want to do it, because that's the most beneficial thing that we can do, or that others can do.
Mm-hmm.
Or that we can do for the others who will be there as well. It's not just for us.
Yeah. And yeah, it's kind of cool to look back at like the stories of Paul's preaching and stuff, to see the passion they had for attending and for fellowshipping and for learning. Today it would be ridiculous to think that we would stay up 10 hours all night just to listen to this one guy talk.
Mm.
But they did that. They did that because they were so excited to learn. And I guess Paul is basically probably a celebrity preacher, but anyway, but even that considered, who today would spend like 10 hours overnight just listening to one guy talk?
Or the idea of meeting daily with fellow Christians, like that being the thing that you do, like after work or whatever, because like Paul met daily in like the synagogue. He was doing it all day, but like I thought that other Christians, they would get done with whatever they were doing, and then they would go there too,
Yeah, it's like Paul was preaching in the synagogues by day, and he was preaching in the churches by night. Sometimes it seems like.
It's a different picture.
Yeah, it's a completely different picture. And so I think something that we should strive for is to have the excitement for learning that they had, because we should be excited for learning, because that is what's gonna bring us closer to understanding who God is.
And here's another idea. Here's something I didn't mention in the video at all, but just a way to think about this is one of the issues with viewing attending church as Well, it just kind of being a habit, a thing that you do, you know, like you're supposed to do it, right? So you do it as much as you can or whatever. The issue with that is that, from a perspective of like raising, children or, in Christ or whatnot, is that if it's just kind of a habit, if it's just a thing you do, then, your kids don't ever
Stop and think about it.
well, they don't have a reason for it. They don't fully develop their own faith. It's just that's a thing they do, and so I think that may be a reason why, a lot of kids in the past couple of generations, they grow up, they start going to college, and then all of a sudden, they're out in the big world and they don't actually have a strong faith of their own. They've been attending church maybe their whole lives,
Yeah.
but then they move out on their own, and then just like that, they fall away from Christianity because their faith wasn't really much of a faith at all.
Yeah, they didn't. Nobody ever explained the value of the church, and probably because for them there probably wasn't much of a value because they didn't really have a faith that they needed it for.
It's just kind of thing you did. They identified as Christian, They, attended church all the time, but it never went beyond that. And so then, when you move out on your own, going to church is still a habit, but then all of a sudden you have kind of your own freedom and control, and you're in control of whether or not you go on a Sunday, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you could do something else with that time. And
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like it's kind of similar to how when the coronavirus lockdown happened, people would everybody couldn't go to church, and then when churches opened back up, people actually came to the realization, like, what do we go to church for? If it's considered dangerous, should we go?
mm-hmm.
And so everybody had to come to that realization, like, this spring, and it definitely helped us think about it a lot better. But
And so some people, even though they could have gone back, they chose not to, and maybe some of them will thought because they're afraid of getting it or because the danger. But I think some people, it's just kind of like, hey, it's kind of nice having a free Sunday morning.
yeah, because they were in the habit, but then the habit was broke by outside forces, and then you had to actually put a lot more work into building a new habit up again.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, yeah, some people just never go back.
It's a sad thing, but and this is something I saw fairly early on, or my opinion with the whole COVID thing. Maybe getting off on a tangent here, but is that it'd make the strong stronger and the weak weaker, essentially.
Yeah. It'd separate the strong from the weak.
Well, that's how any difficult or significantly challenging, like, event or something.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's going to do. The people who are stronger are going to stick around and get stronger. The people who aren't super into it, the what is it? The thorny soil, the
rocky soil.
Rocky soil or the thorny soil, they're gonna fade out.
Yeah.
That's just how it is.
And so it's not all bad, because if they were going to church just out of habit the whole time anyways, then
it's better that they be coming. But if they're just the danger is if we're just attending church, and if we're just kind of doing it in a lukewarm, like, this is what we do kind of fashion, then it's not actually much benefit to us at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you look in Revelations where the Church of Laodicea, he mentions, well, I guess it's Jesus essentially is talking. Do you mean to stop? Jesus essentially is comparing the church to lukewarm water, and that he would prefer that it were either cold or hot. But if it's lukewarm, he's just going to split it out, right?
Yeah.
So if we're just kind of doing our thing, doing our typical Christian duties, and if we're just kind of lukewarm, then it's not actually very much benefit to us.
Yeah, and we just start deceiving ourselves.
And we're just wasting our time.
Yeah.
Might as well live life, right?
Be hot or cold. So I think that things happening where people that were not very invested in church actually did stop coming. I think it's almost more of a good thing than a bad thing. because we realize it makes us realize that just because somebody's coming to church does not mean that they're on the right path. And as the church has progressed in America, you hear of so many people that were in the church that are do these awful things, and every time this happens,
It's kind of like wow, I never would have expected.
Yeah, it hits you again that just because somebody goes to church does not mean they're a good person.
Even if they're involved in activities, that does not mean they're a good person.
Yeah, obviously the Catholic priest scandals where there's all these things that go on.
Things that go on. We'll be as vague as that.
And every time these things happen, like the people in that church, and Catholics have to everybody has to realize that just because somebody's appears to be super godly does not mean they're a good person. They could actually be a very bad person. And so it's good to have trials every once in a while just so you can actually see who's going to come out of this and still be faithful. Because if people are halfway Christians their entire life, that's not doing anybody any good.
Mm-hmm.
It's better for us to recognize that they are halfway Christians than just to assume that they're not.
And if you can't make it through this, then you're probably not going to make it through, 70 years of life or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because as far as catastrophes or, worldwide events go, this is probably on the lesser end of the spectrum.
Yeah, well,
you think of people a couple generations ago had to get drafted and sent to wars.
Even the Cold War wasn't as huge of a deal as a lot of stuff, but it's still a lot more crazy than this is.
Right.
Or a little bit more anyway.
Well, getting drafted and sent to war, that's a lot more to deal with than I could potentially get sick.
Yeah.
What about I could potentially get shot? I don't know.
Yeah.
So anyway, just some further thoughts and discussion on my video, which you can watch as well. This is just kind of further thoughts on it.
Recap
And discussion. But we had another thing we were going to talk about, which is on a fairly similar note, they connect well enough, I think.
Yeah.
Thinking about traditions, and I guess trying to answer maybe the question, are traditions good? Are they bad? Should we follow them? Should we not?
Yeah. And I don't think this answer is going to be that straight. Or it's going to be that blunt or straightforward.
A lot of times they're not.
Because basically, as I was looking at verses to bring to this discussion, you got to remember that traditions aren't a thing that you do. Well, they are. Well, how do I say this? Traditions itself are not good or bad because they're just that's just a term for something that we do over and over and over again, right? And so if the thing that we do over and over and over again is good, then the tradition is good. But the thing that we do over and over and over again is bad, then the tradition is bad. And so traditions themselves is just a term for something that we do repeatedly.
Right.
And so if we do something good repeatedly, that's a good thing. If we do something bad repeatedly, that's a bad thing. So basically what I'm saying is we're not going to come out of this saying that traditions are good or bad.
Right.
At least in my opinion.
It varies greatly.
Yeah.
Depending on what the tradition is.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about what the tradition is. But the concept of traditions is actually biblical. And we can get into that.
Well, I mean, just think about... Well, we were talking about Judaism earlier. Judaism is, full of traditions.
Yeah.
Their entire religion is basically a bunch of traditions or laws,
Yeah. Same thing. In that case.
Kind of, yeah. And so, in our case, as Christians, we have some traditions that are from the Bible, and then we also have a lot of other traditions
that are not.
that we follow that you maybe can't find so easily or at all.
Yeah. So what do we want to jump into? We could. Do we want to go through some of these verses first? I guess.
Sure. So, looking through the Bible and on passages about tradition is one common theme that I can see is that, well, we can see really because you also wrote this, is that traditions can be dangerous when they're followed and when we devote ourselves to them in place of God.
Yeah. Or another way you could say it is we tend to merge traditions with God's commandments for us,
and kind of treat them treat the tradition as a commandment.
Yeah, we follow both of them so religiously that eventually they are one and the same.
They become part of the religion that we. They become part of our religion. Yeah. Even though they're not actually part of what God commands us to do.
Yes, and so that's where you get like verses like I forget where it's found, but what God our Father the religion that our God our Father accepts is as pure and simple as this: to take care of orphans and widows when they're sick, and to keep himself from being polluted by the world.
That's in James.
Anyway, that verse came to mind because a lot of what the New Testament is dealing with or Jesus is dealing with in the New Testament, is overcoming or is challenging the Pharisees' way of thinking, where they were the ones the perfect example of somebody that has God's laws and has traditions, and then they got more and more traditions, and slowly they started taking place of God's laws, and so that's why Jesus is always trying to challenge that way of thinking in the New Testament, because it's a very thing. It's a thing that a lot of them struggled with.
Because thinking of traditions and maybe using them wrong and making them too important is looking at the Pharisees. They're like the best case studies throughout the Bible. Repeatedly, they are they're nitpicking at Jesus and his disciples for not following this or another tradition, and then they end up killing him because essentially he's not like them.
Yeah. Well, they were jealous. The bottom line.
Well, they were jealous, and he wasn't like them. Like, if he was just like them, maybe they still would have been jealous. I don't know.
Yeah. But anyway, there's multiple times where the Pharisees would call out Jesus on something like not washing hands or something like that, and they were like, they had him. But Jesus is like, wait a minute, you guys are forgetting. That's not something that God viewed as important. That's something you came up with. Right. You guys are forgetting that this is not the same thing.
Right. They're confusing them, and so I think it'd be good to look at an example or two of that. And one can be found in Matthew chapter 15 verses 1 through 9, and the same story is in Mark 7 1 through 13 actually. So I'll just read it. Then some Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." And he answered and said to them, "Why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and 'He who speaks evil of his father or mother is to be put to death.' But you say, 'Whoever says to his father, whatever I have that would help you has been given to God,' he is not to honor his father or mother. And by this you invalidate the word of God for the sake of your tradition. You hypocrites, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men.'" So here we have the Pharisees. They're walking up to Jesus and his disciples, and they're being like, "Well, why aren't you guys washing your hands?" You're not following the tradition of the elders, and that's an important thing to note, is that both Matthew and Mark, it points out that this is a tradition established by the elders. And they're like nitpicking Jesus and his disciples for this. But Jesus turns it around because he's like, well, this isn't actually from God. Why are you treating it so important?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's an example of how they started valuing traditions more than they valued God's laws. Jesus pointed out right after that. And that's the danger of traditions, and it becomes part of our religion, but in James it says that our religion should not be complicated at all. It should be free of traditions. It's not a law-based religion anymore.
Mm-hmm. And so if we look at what they're trying to get Jesus and his disciples to do, there's nothing wrong about it at all, or there's nothing righteous about it. They're wanting them to wash their hands before they eat, essentially.
Yeah.
Which, like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I was taught since a kid, you probably were too, to wash your hands before you ate. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is they were taking that and saying, if you don't wash your hands before you eat, you're
gonna go to.
Well, I guess they don't specifically take it that far, but the idea is you're going against the elders. And probably along with that, you're going against God, is what they're saying. So they're taking something as simple as washing your hands before you eat, and they're making it, which should not be a spiritual issue at all. It should just be like a health issue.
Yeah.
And they're making it, well, you've got to do this. Why aren't you doing it?
Well, and I guess it actually under the old law, it was technically a spiritual issue.
I guess it was,
because there's a lot of things that had to do with cleanliness. But
this wasn't one of them because it says it was a tradition of the elders.
Yeah, but just in general. But I think that's kind of what we got to realize is that there's an old law and a new law, and in the new law, Jesus is not really concerned about traditions and cleanliness and stuff. He's more concerned about our relationship with Him,
and about the carrying out the spirit of God's will and not the law that God provided.
And my theory is part of this has to do with Jesus was, or like God through the Old Testament, people was trying to establish cultures on earth that would help us sustain healthier life. But once that was established, that's not really important. That's just basic housekeeping things before we.
Mm-hmm.
But and so there is a place for that, but that's just like day-to-day stuff. It's not.
Don't make it a spiritual issue.
Yeah, it's not. That's not a spiritual issue. It's just like.
Just
it's no.
Do it or don't do it, and then move on.
Yeah, it's like.
And don't try to force other people to do it. Maybe don't shake hands with them if they don't wash their hands. But don't be like, I'm not associating with you because you didn't wash your hands. So in this passage, Jesus kind of flips it on them and says, like, okay, you're transgressing God's commandment because of these traditions. Man, speech is hard. And he brings up this case of, God said, honor your father and your mother, and he who speaks evil of your father or mother is to be put to death. And then he gives this example how they, knowing that, they kind of created this own little tradition, which is kind of like a little loophole where it's like, if you say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't help you because whatever I have, I'm giving it to God. Or in Mark, it uses the term, it's not written here. Corban, I think it is, which is to say, like, belongs to God or something like that. They would say, whatever I have that I could give to you is Corban. In other words, I don't have to do these commandments of God because I am giving everything I have to God.
Yeah. There's actually a story in the Old Testament that is basically the exact same thing.
Well, yeah, like, are you thinking of Saul?
Yeah, when God told Saul to completely destroy this enemy, and he's like, but he took some of the finest, like, animals and
cattle and livestock and the king.
Yeah, and when Samuel asked him about it, he's like, no, this is a sacrifice to God.
Like, I did do God's will, and look, here's a big sacrifice. But the point was he'd been told to kill everything,
Yeah.
and so
it doesn't matter how good, or it doesn't matter how good something appears. If we disobey God, then
so in this case, the Pharisees they kind of created their little loophole so that they could essentially get out of helping their parents. I guess it's pretty heartless. So the little loophole where they could get out of helping their parents, and they could say, "Oh, I'm devoting everything to God," but simultaneously be just completely going against something that God said.
mm-hmm.
So they're kind of they're breaking God's law, but then they kind of have this thing to make them feel like they're still being good and obedient,
Yeah.
And it goes against the whole point.
It's so prevalent in today's society. That happening.
Well, I think it's just kind of prevalent everywhere.
Yeah.
We have a tendency to do it just as the Pharisees did.
Yeah.
We think we are making we kind of make a justification or an excuse, and in doing so, we've kind of veered off from what God said and are kind of following our own little sub-religion, almost.
Yeah. Which is why there's so many denominations in today, because people started putting more value in traditions and over following God's will.
Mm-hmm.
If that wasn't the case, we would all be one church.
And even within a single denomination, even disregarding multiple denominations, a lot of times we can in our own mind kind of create our version of Christianity,
mm-hmm.
where it goes against what the Bible says, but we can still think that we're following the Bible, where we'll kind of shave off some of the stuff that's harder to do and kind of just do it the way that we think it should be.
Mm-hmm.
We have that tendency.
And so I have an interesting provoking question for you. Let's break down our. So both me and Thomas go to the same church, and I've been going here my whole life, and Thomas has been going here for the last 4 years about.
Sure.
Anyway, so you're both pretty familiar with how things run upstairs during a Sunday morning, right?
Yeah.
So as just as a mental game, like, how much of how things are laid out during a Sunday morning are based off tradition, and how much is based off of the direct will of God or word of God?
So the question is okay, so how much is based off of kind of it's a tradition or kind of a way that we've created to do things, and how much it could be found in the Bible, essentially.
Yeah.
Well,
so we get there. We used to get there at 10. And then we'd have coffee and donuts. That was pre-COVID. Well, we'll just go with
no more coffee and donuts.
Well, for now. It's temporary. We get there at 10. We'd have coffee and donuts, or some other type of pastry. And I have a point to this, so we'll just. It's not pointless. Anyway, and then the first thing that would happen is we have a song service, which will last about 4 to 5 songs, and then we'd have communion.
Well, we'd have a communion message.
Which somebody would give supposed to be like a 2 to 5 minute. That some people took longer, but not very structured.
So they'd have that, and then there'd be one more song, and then they would come up and they would say 2 prayers for communion,
mm-hmm.
and then they'd pass out communion.
Yeah.
And then usually the service would be right after that.
And then we'd have a sermon, and then the kids would break off into classes, or at least before we'd switch things up. And then we'd have a sermon that was approximately 25 to 30 minutes long, and it'd have approximately 1 main point and 5 subpoints. And I kind of know this because I run slides. And that just roughly, some people would do it differently, but as a general rule, 4 or 5 subpoints. And then we'd have one song at the end.
And then we'd kind of mingle.
Anyway, and so as there's like one thing in there that I would consider tradition that was installed by God or Jesus. A couple things in there that were values that God put us on, but were not like he didn't say how to do them exactly. He just said that you should do these basic things.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing that I think is the important one is the breaking of bread, right?
Communion, yeah.
Because that was actually Jesus actually said, "Do this, remember to me," and so that is a tradition that I believe Jesus set in place.
Mm-hmm.
And then the sermon should be considered like the devoting themselves to the apostles' teachings, though it could sometimes also be other stuff too, like Old Testament or whatever. And also we have prayer mixed in throughout, which is also one of the things we're supposed to do on a Sunday morning. Let's see, what's that verse again? They continually devoted themselves to prayer.
It's in Acts
to
the apostles' teaching and to prayer.
To
the breaking of bread and to prayer,
yeah. And so I think that's kind of a good guideline as far as the Sunday morning goes, or as far as the church service goes.
And then there are a couple places where we are encouraged to sing, to admonish, and encourage one another, essentially.
Yeah. And so I think all the stuff we do on a Sunday morning is good, right? But
sorry. If we back it up and just look at it as a whole, so if we're not just nitpicking at like the order of things or the specific things, is my initial reaction would be just like, well, aside from some of the specific things, the entire way that we do things is not at all found in the Bible, you know?
Yeah.
It's a very different model.
So basically what I'm saying is nothing that we do is bad, but how would you think that some people would feel if we changed things up drastically but still kept within the confines of the Bible? Like,
or more in the confines of the Bible even.
Yeah, like let's say if we didn't have a sermon, we just had like people sharing passages. Say if we didn't have a song service, we had like a couple songs mixed throughout. You know, a lot of different things like that. There's endless possibilities of how things could be changed.
What if instead of, like two guys going up and giving a prayer in front of everyone, what if he was just like a big prayer circle?
Yeah. There's so many different things that would not be wrong. It might even be closer to how they did it in the early church. And I feel like if that happened, there would be people in our church that would be very
angry.
angry.
You break with tradition. Sometimes people aren't happy.
And I would have trouble accustoming to it, and I think we all would. And so I think this is kind of like a little cool thing to think about, because we could change up everything to how we do a Sunday morning, and it would not be bad. It might even be closer to how they did it. And we wouldn't. A lot of people wouldn't like that at all. But the reason is not. But the point is, the reason is not because of what the Bible says. The reason is because of tradition.
Yeah, because you're doing things differently.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it just from the very start, the Bible never mentions a church-owned building.
Yep.
Never. So if we were going by the biblical example, is they just kind of met wherever they could. They met in houses. They sometimes met like along the river or in public meeting spaces, like the Sanhedrin or something, just kind of wherever.
Yeah.
And, once they started getting persecuted, they would have done it more in hiding. So our example is that we don't have any church buildings to look at. So right away, the whole idea of we got to do it in a church building. We all got to be seated in these nice lined up pews, looking at one guy who's doing a thing. Where it's not really biblical. I guess the Bible does. Paul gets into talking about how there should only be one guy kind of speaking at once, basically, just so it's not chaos. But aside from that, the whole. I guess the whole model of we all sit down and then we kind of have this spiritual feeding passive while we're sitting passively, that you can't find it.
Yeah. And I want to say that I don't think that anything we do is at least to my knowledge, is against the Bible. But there are better ways we could do things probably, and I think the way we do it right now is so engrossed in tradition, even though we probably don't think of it as tradition. We just think of it as how we do things.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a tradition, and I think we would have trouble breaking from it. And if tradition started leading us farther and farther from God's intent for the church, like happened with the Catholic Church,
Mm-hmm.
tradition started to take over, and people started taking advantage of the church because people were so caught up in tradition, or caught up in the checking of the boxes side of it.
Eventually, that became more of a focus than the reasons why those things were originally done.
Yeah.
Which has happened time again. So you can look at Catholicism, you can look at the Anabaptists and so Mennonites and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Most denominations really, because a lot of them actually have a lot of leftovers from Catholicism still.
Mm-hmm.
There's just tradition is so deeply, buried at the core of how we worship that we can't necessarily picture doing it a different way.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that's another benefit of our spring lockdowns, is it gave us the opportunity to reevaluate how we did things. And we ended up doing like house churches for a little while, which I think was a good exercise in realizing that you don't need to meet in a building for it to be church.
Mm.
Yeah, but anyway, I just want to re-emphasize the fact that every church denomination has traditions, and some of them are stronger than other denominations. And some denominations have more. The Catholics have a lot. We don't have a lot, but we do have more than we think.
We have a decent number.
We have more than we realize we have.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't think of them as traditions, and that's part of the problem.
That's just what's normal, right?
Yeah.
It's just normal to have a building, right? It's just normal to have a very structured service.
So I think we should realize that, because otherwise we sometimes, if we get too engrossed in our way of doing things that are really traditions, if you think about it, we start to subconsciously feel that they have inherent value.
Mm-hmm.
Which is the same thing that happened to the Pharisees. And they started to see their traditions have an inherent value, and they slowly started to become more and more valuable as they became more and more deep in their traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you, for some reason, needed to adapt, you may not be willing to. Like if you had to adapt.
Whoa.
Like
COVID.
No, it's something stuck in my throat. If you had to adapt to overcome an obstacle, say like COVID lockdowns, or you need to change things up, maybe even because of persecution.
All of a sudden, it feels like it's threatening your Christianity.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be, because our Christianity is not meeting in a building and doing these things.
Yeah, so let me ask you this question, just for you to ponder.
Yeah.
So, I guess it's a question for you, but it's also for anyone. If all of a sudden you were to find yourself without, I guess kind of like lockdowns, without the ability to do church as we normally do it, so all of a sudden you don't have your church building, you don't have your normal services. If you were left without that all of a sudden, would that affect you being you as a Christian?
I'd like to say no. And I think I do have some case study for that, because we did have a lockdown for a little while. But it would be difficult, because I do get a lot of encouragement from coming to church.
Mm-hmm. But it's just something to think that we should all be thinking about. It's like, okay, if going to church was completely removed, just assume it stops existing or we stop being able to, whether because of persecution or because of some, catastrophic event or something, would our Christianity remain?
Mm-hmm.
It's something to think about. And we had a little bit of a, taste test of that with some lockdowns for a while where we had to do things differently all of a sudden. And all of a sudden, we couldn't use the church building, right? You had to do things on your own or watch videos or something. You were all of a sudden given a lot more responsibility with what you did as far as, what you did on Sunday, or you all of a sudden had to do a lot more of it on your own.
Mm-hmm.
Just an interesting thought.
Yeah. And so as far as traditions in a church setting, I think there is the value in them, in my opinion, is that they hold you on a good path. Like tradition of communion holds us to that. Being tradition helps us to remember Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection,
which was its purpose.
Which was its purpose of that tradition. Tradition of singing is good because singing is good. Tradition of preaching is good because preaching is good. But I forgot.
But sometimes, so far as like the traditions of like how we do something, they're not necessary.
Yeah, but traditions can also be dangerous. That's what I was going with. Traditions can also be dangerous in a church setting because it could take over. It could take over the. And so I think it'd be an interesting concept to throw around. Would be, what if we change things at church for, do things differently? Like a lot of newer churches. Have you ever noticed? Or you were talking to me about. I think you mentioned something last week after we recorded about how there was just one church that was growing so fast that they had to split off into a bunch of houses and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like newer churches tend to be more flexible, and they'll change things up like that because they're not rooted in tradition as much.
And especially newly established churches in like countries that just received the gospel or something, they'll often split very frequently, and sometimes there'll be one that has split and planted 50 other churches or something, and then those will plant their own. So sometimes, there's this. Things move much faster. Things are kind of kept smaller. You don't see a church getting, super large because once it gets big enough, some of those people leave and go somewhere else, and then they start a church.
Yeah, and so basically the traditions, because since this church here is very entrenched in traditions, whether we recognize it or not, it would make it more difficult for us to overcome and adapt to challenges. Like if our church got too big, we would have a hard time doing that because that we've always been in one building like this.
Mm-hmm.
If there's so many number of things that examples like that, like how it would be hard for us to adapt just because of our traditions would hold us back.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the danger of traditions.
Right.
Is that aspect.
And so one danger is definitely, well, I guess I'm kind of seeing like maybe three dangers here. The first one being we make them too important for ourselves, and then they kind of substitute God, or they kind of become God.
They become the same,
Yeah, they kind of become one with God. Another is that they can make us less flexible to change and kind of go the direction that God is sending us. Is that if we're too rooted in our traditions, if we feel like that tapping on our shoulder, like hey, this needs to happen, we're not going to do it because
we've always done it this other way.
Because we've done it this other way, and if we were going to do something new, we'd also have to do it the same way. And so a third way, though, I think that traditions can be dangerous is going back to the Pharisees, is when we start saying to somebody else, you need to be doing this because if you don't, you're not properly following God, is essentially, so taking that important, so we view the traditions so important enough, and now we're then pushing them onto other people, which is something that Pharisees were doing. They were trying to get Jesus and his disciples to do stuff. And that's a danger for us as well.
Yeah.
So I can think of like church groups where some of them because they got into legalism, or others because that's just, I don't know exactly how.
There's a good example of this in today's church, non-instrumental versus instrumental, right?
Right. And so some will say if you use an instrument, you're going to hell.
Yeah.
Not all non-instrumental churches are that severe, but some of them are.
Yeah.
And they'll look at you as an unbeliever if you use an instrument.
So that's a good example of how their tradition of not using an instrument has become the same as any other sin that, and sometimes it seems like they think of it as worse, but
Yeah, sometimes.
But any other sin that we could commit, but that's, as far as I understand, not in the Bible.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, and they can pull some scriptures from the Bible and think that, but there's so many other things like that. So I've known of church groups who thought it was a sin to watch TV or to play cards or dance or listen to music with drums in it.
There's just so many weird things that are just...
And for almost all of these things, they would be able to point to a few verses in the Bible and say, see, look, this proves our point. Like, so it's not like they just said it, but they would always be able to find some sort of justification in order to say that this was required. But obviously the Bible doesn't have TVs in them. It doesn't say anything about TVs. And so you could maybe think of some reasons why it would be good not to have a TV. But the moment you start saying you can't have a TV, and you start saying to other fellow Christians, you can't have a TV, this is wrong, when the Bible doesn't say that. The moment you start doing that, then you've taken the tradition too far. And, or I guess tradition, or I guess that almost comes into the point where it's not so much tradition as just kind of like a...
Yeah. Well, it could be a tradition. It could just be a
self-made law.
Yeah, it depends on the situation. But that's an example of how even tradition was reinforcing a good concept. Let's see probably one of those is a good concept.
Well, so like not watching TV.
Okay.
Like there are a lot of things that could be really bad on TV.
Okay, so that could be a good concept. But if you use it to push onto other people that do watch TV and use it to judge them, and therefore push them out of your church, that's a very bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're using a good concept that you turned into a law or tradition and use that to do a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the end, it's a bad.
Right. Or don't play cards because, you could get into gambling and then you'll be a poor steward of your money or something like that.
Yeah.
There are good reasons for it, but you can't push things on people because then you've essentially, so like at the end of that passage in Matthew, what Jesus kind of says of the Pharisees is, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. So the moment we start teaching as doctrine our own rules, our own laws, our own ideas,
mm-hmm.
we've crossed that line, and now we're messing up.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the kind of things where it's like you have to examine it. You have to examine the Bible and see what is right, and you have to make that decision based on what you know. So like, do you think TV's wrong? Okay, don't watch TV. Make that decision for yourself, and then maybe you can say like, hey, here's some, like, say to someone else like, here's some reasons why I don't do it, but you shouldn't say you can't do it.
Yeah.
Unless the Bible actually fairly clearly says you can't do it.
Yeah. There's some good verses about this. Let's see. Or about the idea. There's some verses about the idea that a lot of traditions are very personal. Like, you could do this tradition and do it for good reasons, or you could abstain from this same tradition and do it also for good reasons.
All right, go ahead and read that one.
So, in Romans 14:5-6, it says, "One person esteems one day as better than another, while another person esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God."
And so I think the context for a lot of this is Paul is talking about like people who are still kind of wanting to follow some of the Jewish traditions of like following certain days or not eating certain foods. And what he's essentially saying is now none of that stuff really matters. We're not under all those laws and those boxes we have to check. Mm-hmm. We have a lot more freedom, but you could maybe still decide one way or the other for yourself. And so what he's essentially saying is whatever you decide, just decide it and stick with it.
and do it for God, not for yourself.
And do it for the honor of God. So if you're going to decide that you shouldn't eat something for, the reason, some reason, then don't eat it for the honor of God, or if you can, eat it and rejoice God for it,
Yeah. And so that's, and so that comes down to like the what you were talking about earlier, where some people always say you can't do this or this because it's bad. But then I think that's where this verse applies. It's like, if you do it, you should be convinced in your own mind that it's good and do it for God. If you don't do it, you should be convinced in your own mind. So that applies to basically everything you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. Well, like dancing is a good example. You can definitely dance for God. It's very biblical, and also dancing can be seen in a bad light. Mm-hmm. And then in that case, you could abstain for God if that's what you thought of it as. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of traditions that we have in our modern church would fall under this, like how we structure church in the morning, or how on the Sunday morning we structure it in such a way, and we should do that in glory of God. Or if we structure it in a different way, we could also do that in glory of God.
And we should always try to seek the best way, a way that will lead to, people developing deeper relationships with God and learning more, or whatever way that we can best achieve God's glory and spread His gospel. But at the same time, we can't say
but this is the best way to do this.
We have to do it this way.
Yeah.
Or but we should be seeking the best way. So kind of an example of this, something this reminded me of, something that came up recently, or a little while ago in our church, is the decision of whether or not we were going to mandate masks. Mm-hmm. Which, you smile knowingly. We had several men's meetings on this, way too many heated discussions on this as well. So basically, under the current orders from the governor, in services we are supposed to be wearing masks the entire time, essentially. And there are some people who do that, but then there are some people who don't for a variety of reasons. And so this issue brought up is, are we going to essentially mandate and require that everyone in the church does it? And are the elders going to do it, essentially?
Yeah.
And I kind of saw it like these verses describe as like, well, so you could bring up issues like submitting to authority, and yes, we should submit to authority, but I cannot, as a Christian, and the elders cannot, even as elders, point to someone and say, you have to do this, because if you don't do it, you're not submitting to authority. It's kind of an issue that each individual person kind of has to decide for on their own. Mm-hmm. So, yes, you should submit to authority, but you can't really submit by just being forced. That's not submission.
Yeah, and obviously people have various degrees or understandings of what that means. Mm-hmm. And so that comes back to this, if we wear a mask, we should do that in honor for God. If we don't wear a mask, we should do that in glory for God too. And if we're doing that, then the best decisions should come of that, right? Mm-hmm. If everybody's doing what they're doing for the glory of God, then good decisions should come from that.
And the wrong way to do that would be to say, like, here's what I've decided for myself, is that, like, I need to wear a mask in order to properly submit to the governor's authority. Therefore, you need to also, and you need to also. And if you don't wear a mask, you can't come to church. And, that it starts kind of crossing a boundary where it's like, yes, you're doing this for a good reason, because we should submit to authority. But you're also maybe you're kind of also creating a law,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Those are just my thoughts on it.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely, this verse applies to, I think definitely would apply to that situation. Yeah.
I mean, we get back to thinking about, like, washing your hands. Like, washing your hands isn't a spiritual issue by itself. It's maybe a good thing to do, but wearing a mask, some people don't see that as a spiritual issue at all. Some people do. And you should maybe give them reasons for why, like, here's maybe why you should. But you can't say you have to, essentially. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was me just kind of giving an example of something that popped up recently, which this reminded me of. I don't know if it fully applies. And obviously you can't just say, for any issue, you can't force me to do this. That's just, you're making a law out of nothing. I might interpret it differently. Because if the Bible does say something, then you are able to rebuke someone who's not in line with that, right?
Yeah.
Because, the scriptures can be used for reproving and rebuking. That's part of their purpose, kind of. But this is so we can't just point at anything and be like, oh, well, you can't force me to do that. Like, if it's in the Bible, you should be able to bring them before somebody, to bring the like the verses before someone and say, like, hey, maybe you're not following this exactly. You can still do that, but just don't force something that isn't in the Bible, essentially.
And I think what it comes down to is that we're all responsible for our own faith. And at the end of the day, we're the ones that have to come to account with what we've decided.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as far as the church is concerned, there are some things that we should not allow to happen within our congregation. But there are some things that we should realize that they're an individual decision, and they hopefully have their reasons for it. And if they don't, that's their own prerogative.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we shouldn't try to help them, but we shouldn't try to cause division over it either in a lot of situations.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a verse of there's a verse about what is acceptable to not unite over, but it's like 6 things. We should all be of one faith, one baptism, one. I forget the verse.
Me too. Well, yeah.
Basically, the gist of it is that there are I think it listed off like 4 things that we should all agree on. Basically, is what I understood it to mean. But other than that, we should not let other stuff besides those things cause a divide in the church. And that also the verse from James also applies. Religion, the God our Father accepts as pure, simple as opening the orphans and windows in their stress and keeping oneself from being polluted by the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so both of those verses kind of show us that religion is not a complicated thing. It's
not as much as you make it.
Yeah, and if it is complicated, that's probably an issue.
Yeah, it's a sign that we've added some stuff somewhere down the line.
Yeah. Yeah.
So So getting back to the idea of kind of traditions, and as I have another verse to kind of think about, which is going right along with what we were talking about. So Colossians 2:16-17. Therefore no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or new moon or Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So this kind of goes along with the same idea, which is people, as Christians, we can't judge someone in regard to their choice for certain things. Like this mentions food or drink, or like, following a certain festival or a day.
Yeah.
Like that. We should not judge people for those things because, well, it comes back to being a personal decision.
It doesn't matter as far as our walk with God. Or it does, but in such a way that we can do that to please God, or we can do that, or we can abstain from that to please God.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does matter, but it doesn't matter as far as what we decide does not matter to other people.
And I like what verse 17 says, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So sometimes we put a lot of stock into those things, but what this is essentially saying is they're a shadow. It just doesn't matter. So like, whether or not you watch TV, whether or not you play cards, or this kind of thing, the thing itself doesn't matter. Just do whatever you think is best, and whatever you have decided is best. But when it comes down to it, God is not going to judge us based on whether or not we watch TV. He might judge us based on our reasonings, or he might judge us based on our actions that came of that. But when it comes down to it, we shouldn't be judging people for those kind of things. Like, we confront people about what we think is right, but we don't say, it's wrong for you to do this. It's wrong for you to eat this. It's wrong for you to, don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't follow tradition to the point where you're going to say that somebody else needs to do it, or else they're not a good Christian, or else they're going to hell.
And I think something to be applicable from the last verse you read is, we don't, in our church anyway, we don't really have people celebrating Jewish holidays, but we do have people celebrating things like Easter and Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And some people we also have some people that abstain from celebrating those holidays.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that verse very well applies to that situation, where those who abstain for reasons that they believe,
mm-hmm.
and those who celebrate for reasons they believe in.
Right.
So it's a perfect example, because and from that verse, the takeaway is we shouldn't judge people that have the opposite opinion on us on those things.
It's just like, well, yeah, they're neither of those neither Christmas or Easter, celebrating them or not celebrating, is going to do you anything as far as your walk with Christ, or getting you to heaven.
Well, as it said, is you should, if you celebrate Christmas, you could celebrate it for the glory of God.
You could also just celebrate it as just worldly holiday.
You could do that, which a lot of people do too. Or you could, and some people that I know choose not to celebrate it for various, but
because they think it's pagan.
Because it originated from pagan holiday.
Yeah. So and that's fine too.
And so that they're also doing it for glory of God, and so it's a good example, because both of us are doing a different thing, but both for God's glory.
So just don't argue with them.
Yeah.
Because there's no reason to.
Yeah, exactly. That's the takeaway from that, is you shouldn't let that cause division among you.
Or even among people who celebrate Christmas, there's like the people who have a Christmas tree, and there's the people who don't, because they think a Christmas tree is going too far. And so it's an example of a silly thing that people can have heated debates about, because really, if they start having heated debates about it, they got off track somewhere, right? Don't get in a heated debate about that. Don't judge people because of whether or not they have a Christmas tree.
I've done that.
Just don't. Well, stop doing it. Don't do it anymore. Right, unless you're just joking.
Yeah, that's a funny one.
So a few verses down in Colossians 2 still, so 2, 20 through 23, it says some more things which are also good. So if you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with use, in accordance with the commandments and the teachings of men? These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. So again, the context of all of this is essentially people in the early church were still trying to follow a lot of Jewish traditions, and so there's a lot of the New Testament is basically about the conflicts because of that. So this is what it's talking about, but I think it's equally applicable now. It's essentially saying, like, don't submit yourself to these decrees of do or do not do this certain thing, because they're not really profitable. And when it comes right down to it, they're just kind of, they all have to do with things that are destined to perish with you. So, like, do not eat something, or do not have a Christmas tree. What does it matter? The Christmas tree is going to burn or decay.
Or sit in your garage for the next 20 years.
Or sit in your garage and mold. And I really like the last verse, because I think that this is something that happens a lot to us. So these are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. So I think of a lot of the silly little traditions or things that we've talking about, and there's so many more that we could go on about, and a lot of times those kind of things, they look good. They look like, oh man, that looks very spiritual. That looks like they have good reasons for it, and I can really see where they're coming at, and it looks like a good thing that a good Christian would do.
Oh, I have a good. So
go ahead.
In our church, some people in our church take pride in the fact that we have a very large majority of the people singing during our song services. And when you were saying that, I was just thinking, like, that can look very good, but it's, at the end of the day, it's just tradition.
And it's not really an accurate indication of, like, how zealous the congregation is.
Yeah. Just because we have good vocal cords.
Just because maybe people like to sing.
I think it comes down to tradition. We sing because we traditionally have, and a lot of us come from music backgrounds. And so that's just, I was just throwing that in there.
So I mean, that's an example of a tradition that the Bible does talk a little bit about, and it's something that can look very good, but the singing in and of itself what this says here is maybe it doesn't have much value at all. It's the things that can come from singing,
Yeah.
So there can be encouragement from singing. I know sometimes certain songs are either emotional or they just have a really good message in them, and sometimes people will be convicted by them, or even sometimes come to Christ from a song, which is like, hey, that's great. Songs have their place, but also sometimes the act of singing, we act as if it's going to give us holy points or something, and maybe it won't.
Yeah.
But so there's a long list of things where if we do them, it looks good spiritually. Like if we, like, for instance, I grew up in a church, a circle of churches kind of thing, where it was very common and very I would almost just say popular to, like, preach against, like, alcohol or smoking or something. And I'm not just talking about, like, every once in a while. I'm like, if there was a rally or something, or a Bible camp, every single sermon would at some point mention this.
Oh, wow.
and it's because that was one of the big things they focused on, is don't smoke, don't drink alcohol, don't do drugs. And so almost every sermon, no matter what the topic was would at some point hit on it. And so I've been in church groups like that and it looks really good and they have really good arguments and things. But when it comes right down to it, they're focusing so much on those things and they're not nearly as much focused on other more important things sometimes.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of funny.
It's a dangerous trap we can all fall into. And I mean, the Bible does say some things about alcohol, but like smoking or drugs, you kind of have to use more general principles to get there.
I think the general principle about alcohol is you shouldn't become drunk, which high is equivalent to that. But anyway,
yeah,
it's a thing that you can do that can lead to sin, and some people do it, they don't sin, and so it's in that regard it's kind of funny to think about how creative they must be to manage to work that into every sermon. But people get pretty creative, so
they do. I mean, it's just that was one of like the big sins, right?
Yeah,
that was the big sin that you absolutely had to stay away from, as if that was like the biggest temptation.
Well, I mean,
maybe in some circles
it probably was in that time in that circle. Now we have bigger ones, but
maybe, who knows?
Well, in a lot of where.
Well, like when you hear about like, you know, the big revivals, you know, or like Billy Sunday or Billy Graham, you know, like how they'd preach a sermon and all the bars would close because, you know, that's just kind of one of those. Not so much anymore, I don't think, but for a while it definitely was one of those, like around the time of the Prohibition, like that was one of those like big things you could preach against and like, you know, get the big numbers.
Yeah.
Anyway, getting off topic. It's so what I get from this verse is just kind of the we have to be careful not to do things which look good, which look really spiritual, but actually don't have very much value or any value. We got to stick to more than any tradition. We got to stick to what God commands us to do, right?
Yeah.
We got to stick to the core things, to faith and to grace and to obedience, right? To trusting in God.
Going back to your thing about the story about them all preaching against alcohol and drugs and whatever. I think there's another thing you could take from this is they were preaching against an act you could do, but they weren't preaching against so much what led to the act.
Mm.
They weren't preaching against, or they weren't as focused with trying to get these young people to deepen their relationship with Christ, which would help them prevent from falling into this trap. Mm. And so that's a good example of how if we focus too much on the outward symptoms of problems that people had that they were talking about in these sermons, that's an example of how they can talk about something that you can visually see, but they don't focus on the root issue here.
That's a good point.
And so that kind of comes back to like traditions versus God's will. Our relationship with God. If our relationship with God is good, then we don't need to have these people telling us not to do these things, or these traditions telling us to do these things. Mm-hmm. If our relationship with God is good and we strive to serve Him.
Yeah, if we focused on it at a deeper level more often, maybe we wouldn't have to so much teach on these outward physical things, because people would be able to examine it based on their own knowledge and their own spiritual maturity, and they could look at the Bible and say, you know, I think this is what I need to do or not do. Mm-hmm. And they'll have the maturity to maybe go to someone else about it instead of just
falling for whatever. Yeah. And so this is kind of like a good comparison from traditions to, that's the same way it is with traditions. Traditions are the outward appearance, but they are driven by our inward desires. And so if inward desires are good, then the outward appearance will be good too. Mm-hmm. And so people are caught up in the outward appearance side of things, and they'll start preaching against the symptoms of problems, and they'll start holding to traditions. Mm-hmm. Instead of preaching at the root of the problems and holding to God's will.
Right.
And so I think it kind of ties together well.
Yep, definitely. And we just have to be careful that we are not focusing on external things in our lives when the problem maybe lies deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and a good example of that maybe is going back, I guess a couple weeks ago to me, to my video in our podcast about, well, I guess it was my video, it wasn't a podcast about it, but thinking about diligence is I started recognizing that diligence wasn't just, an issue of am I lazy or not lazy. It wasn't just an external thing. Is I kind of saw that it had its roots much deeper in me, where it was more of a struggle between,
your desire or your
between my desires, between spirit and flesh, between, basically wanting to live worldly, live and follow after the world and kind of do what was easy or pleasurable,
mm-hmm.
and the desire to do what was right, which is sometimes harder,
So basically, what you're saying is the whole, like, whether or not you made videos was an outward symptom of your inward priorities and other stuff.
Yeah. So like my lack of diligence was, well, not entirely, but it kind of had some of its roots in deeper issues, like for instance, like not keeping a steady, like daily Bible reading habit or something like that, or frequently prayer, a prayer habit, stuff like that. It wasn't so much of like an issue of me being lazy or something. It'd be an issue of like I come to the moment and be like, I should do that, but I don't really want to.
Yeah,
because
your priorities will determine what you do.
Because like I could do something more fun, or it kind of got to that point where like I could do something more productive, and so it's just my own internal desires weren't to the right place to where I would seek to do that more than the other things that I could do, essentially. Mm-hmm. So it's just something we always have to be on the lookout for, is in ourselves, well, mostly in ourselves, but maybe also in other people, so that we can help them, is that we're not focusing on the physical external things that look good, or the actions that we can take. We have to get ourselves right deeper down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that's what traditions are all about. They're a way to manage our external actions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem with traditions, is they're not managing our internal walk. But I think also traditions have a place with, if you're a younger Christian or you're starting out on your path, to help us to, like, for instance, you could install a strict tradition of reading the Bible every day until you got to the point where you did it without the tradition of it.
Right. So in some ways, traditions are kind of like the spiritual milk.
Yeah.
As we're on our journey to getting mature, and then once we're actually mature, they're not a thing we need so much.
Yeah, we should learn to let go of them because we don't need them anymore, and they can actually hold us back in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Except for the purpose of using them to bring in newer Christians,
mm-hmm.
to kind of continue the cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, but traditions are a way to kind of build ourselves and to hold to a path until we can see clearly on our own, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously the important thing is you have the right traditions to begin with. Right,
and you avoid some of the dangers, the potential pitfalls that we've discussed here.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if we read this yet. 1 Corinthians 11:2. It kind of talks about this. Now I command you, because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions. Or I commend you. And maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. This is Paul talking here. And from what I understand, it sounds like he he set in place traditions in the Corinthian church, and I think this kind of ties in because the church needed traditions to start to build,
Mm-hmm.
and so the
So he's praising them for keeping the good traditions that he left for them.
yeah, and so that's a good example of how traditions can be good because as a new church they needed something to guide them because as humans we don't.
And Paul was that thing that kind of guided them, the things that he left for them. And I think it's important to, it's good to note the verse right before that, 1 Corinthians 11:1. Be imitators of me just as I also am of Christ. So it's this idea of, so Paul kind of left these traditions for them, which were essentially just kind of a reflection of Christ, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important that we follow the good traditions left for us, which we can find in the Bible. We can find, the way the apostles lived, the way Jesus lived. Those are kind of our traditions,
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to, and it's important for us to kind of ask ourselves, are we following those? Are we keeping with them?
The meeting together, the breaking of the bread, the apostles' teaching and prayer. Those are the traditions that can be found in the Bible.
To the ultimate purpose of God's glory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's about it.
Yeah, good episode. This is our 5th episode of the Salt of the Earth
Podcast.
More coming next week and then the week after that, and kind of on a
Weekly schedule.
weekly schedule.
That's pretty much the plan, and we'll try to get videos out every week as well. And so every week we'll be, again, like today, discussing a video from the week
Mm-hmm.
and kind of being further thoughts on that, and
Yeah.
then we'll have a topic as well.
Yeah.
And hopefully soon we'll have some guests.
That's the goal. So, I mean, if you haven't already noticed, our videos that me or Thomas make come out on Sunday or Monday at 7 a.m. And then the podcast comes out on Friday at 7 a.m. And we talk about the Monday video and the Friday podcast. So that's when we're recording this right now on a Thursday.
So now you know all of our secret plans.
But we usually record on Fridays. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next week.
And be salty.